morning, friends. I'm glad to welcome you today to Uncommon Virtues. I'm just here a minute early, getting started, getting some of the settings going. I trust you all are doing really well today. I'm glad you're joining me. As you join in, wouldn't you mind? If you don't mind, please sign in. Let us know who you are and where you're joining us from. It'd be great to just see who is here with us today. I'm really looking forward to this study and to gathering. Hello, Rachel. Glad to have you here with us this morning. And it's a beautiful sunny day here in Shawnee, Kansas. Good morning, Gigi. Great to have you here with us this morning as well. And what a beautiful day it is. Going to enjoy the nice sunshine. I'm going out for a walk a little bit later. Let's see. Dawn, you're here. Hi, Sarah from Houghton in New York. Vicki, great to see you this morning. So fun to see all your names. I wish we could all be in a room together where we could actually physically talk with one another. Wouldn't that be really fun? But that doesn't seem to get to happen as often as we would like that to. Let's see, we've got somebody broadcasting live on our page as well as we get into our study this morning, but hang on here just a minute. All right. Well, great to have you all here. I am really looking forward to this study today. As I was preparing, I just thought, I don't know, every week I think I get excited about the material and what we're looking at. And even though I've spent a lot of time in it, I look forward to even more time in it with all of you. First of all, I want to say to all of you, thank you so much for your prayers, for our family as we laid my father to rest this last week. So we were having this study last week. I did not know that my dad was passing from this life to the next. What a wonderful man he was. What a great example he was. And I'm grateful that I've had such a wonderful father. I did get to go to Idaho and be with my brothers as we laid my dad to rest over the weekend. And again, thank you for your prayers, for your love during this time. I really appreciate it. I do want to remind you that there is lifelong learning for this course. The code number is 55069. If you are a minister in the Church of the Nazarene, you can receive lifelong learning 55069. Also, that all of the royalties from this study will go to Nazarene Compassionate Ministries. And I just share that because this is a really important time to be sharing through Nazarene Compassionate Ministries because we have so many needs of people around the world. And I just have to share with you that day by day, I'm hearing more stories from countries outside of the United States where the situation is becoming very desperate, where people are hungry and are in need of food. There's one country where families are raising a white flag outside their home to let people know we don't have food and we are hungry. And so we want to be able to respond and help people to the best of our ability during this time. So thank you for your help and support. I'm going to help and support Nazarene Compassionate Ministries, and we'll try to do this together as we try to get through this incredible time with this COVID crisis and the way that it has affected our world. I do want to take us this morning as just a reminder into our scripture passage, and I do want to tell you that just to make it easier, I have gone ahead and posted all the slides for today. They're already on the small group site. So if I mention a picture or some quote you might think is interesting, I probably have already put those on slides and you can access those and look at those. So let's begin again with our scriptures. 2 Peter 1, starting with verse 3. His divine power has given us everything needed for life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. So remember this, it is divine power that helps us to live the holy life. It is what we receive from God that empowers us to be able to live as God's holy people in the world. And this is God's intent. And God's intent is that when we are so filled with him, that we live differently. So beginning with verse 4, thus he has given us through these things his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may escape from the corruption that is in the world because of lusts, and may become participants of the divine nature. I hope that is gripping you, that you understand that this is an invitation into a holy relationship with the holy God. And then he goes on to say, for this reason, you and I, we must make every effort to support our faith with goodness and goodness with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with endurance, and endurance with godliness, and godliness with mutual affection, and mutual affection with love. For if these things are yours and are increasing among you, they keep you from being ineffective and unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. This is this understanding from Peter that you add one thing onto your faith and the other, and so that you ever increased in your faith and ever increase in your participation with God in this world. So today we're going to be about kindness and about Theosebia. Kindness, just so we remember, is associated with the love of God. It's a reflection of the very nature and the character of God, which is what we also hear from that passage in 1 Peter. If you look at the pictures that I posted today, you're going to find a picture of me standing next to a man. I'm in a shop in Athens. It was a number of years ago. My daughter and I had gone on that trip where we'd gone to Cappadocia. The trip ended in Athens. And as we were there, everywhere we had gone, actually, we had been looking for a picture or an icon of the Cappadocian fathers. And even out in Cappadocia, they didn't have them. They had icons of Peter and Paul and Mary, literally, but they never had the Cappadocians. And I kept wondering, where am I going to find it? So we're walking through the streets of Athens. I had gone into one store and somebody said, oh yeah, I have one, but they had Basil of Caesarea, Gregory Nazianzen, and then they had John Chrysostom, which is another guy that could be considered a Cappadocian father, but he's not part of that relationship. And they had that one. It was a nice big one, but it was $700. I said, there's no way. I'm not buying that. I can't do that. So I end up catching up with my daughter, who's gone into this little icon shop, and she says, Mom, the guy's upstairs rummaging around. I said, why is he rummaging around? She said, well, I asked him if he had an icon or a picture of the Cappadocian mothers. And I said, well, honey, nobody knows really what that means. And she said, well, he looked at me and he said, do you mean like Nonna? And I said, yeah. And we were stunned that he would even know of that name. And so he was upstairs rummaging around. And finally, he comes back downstairs and he said, I ordered an icon of the Holy Family. And this is the picture that they sent me. And he holds up the picture that I'm holding in the photo that you'll see that I posted. And on it are all these different people. And it's the entire family of Basil of Caesarea, that holy family. And at the very top of it is Macrina. And then it has all these other family members. Plus, he only wanted $45 for it. Good deal. So I got that one. And then as I'm looking at this icon, I began looking through at every person that was on it. And on the icon was Theosebia, listed here in the picture as part of this holy family. Now, by this time, I'd already been doing quite a bit of research on on this family, and the placement of Theosebia, just nobody could quite figure out where she belonged. Now, I found it really fascinating that somewhere through history, she had been painted into this family. So what are the suggestions? What people have said about this woman, Theosebia? Some have suggested that she was maybe married to Gregory of Nyssa. Others at that point in time had said, well, no, maybe she was married to Gregory of Nazianzus. But it was this icon that really made me stop and think about it and say, what if she really is a member of this big family? So Amelia actually was at the top, and then all of her children below. The children were identified by name, including Macrina, Theosebia, Necratius, Gregory of Nyssa, Basil the Great, the father Basil, and Peter Sebast. So here she was, Theosebia, ensconced in the family of Basil the Great. Now her name is really fascinating too. Theo means God. Sibia means liness or likeness. So her name itself means godliness or God likeness. An amazing lady about whom we don't know a lot. But the more that we dug into the information, the more we were sort of able to extrapolate out more about her. So during that period of time in history, epigrams were written at the time of people's death. Those were just short little sayings that were written in honor of people. So Gregory of Nazianzus, who is one of the Cappadocian fathers, who was Basil's best friend, he writes an epigram when Amelia, the mother, dies. It's epigram number 164, in which he writes, "And you, Theosebia, child of noble Amelia, and in truth yoke fellow of the great Gregory, lie here in holy soil, O support of pious women. At a seasonable age you departed this life." Now, what's interesting is people have read that and they thought, now, was Emilia a yoke fellow of who? Which Gregory? Of himself or of Gregory of Nyssa or of somebody else? Just a lot of questions around that epigram. And yet we recognize Theosebia mentioned here as the child of Emilia. Now, I just want us to imagine then that she is a part of that family, because there's enough evidence now that really brings us her into being part of that family. But she was younger than Macrina. So when the whole family moved in the city and they go out to the family, what becomes the family monastery, the family place of ministry, it's at a place called Annecy. Theosebia is a beautiful young lady. Now, you might remember there was this time when Macrina, the sister, chided the brother Basil when he came back from university and said, "You are all puffed up. You're doing all this stuff about rhetoric. You need to come out here to the family monastery and you need to study and you need to understand what this life of holiness is about." They came out, he did, and he brought his best friend Gregory Nazianzen with him, and they studied. But can't you imagine that while they're out there studying and really seeking the face of God, this young girl, Theosebia, she's just part of the family and she's there. And Gregory of Nazianzus gets to know her during that period of time. Now, history names Nazianzen the theologian. So when you see references to the theologian in the early part of Christianity, they're talking about him. I mean, he becomes so well known that his nickname is just the theologian. Later in life, he becomes the bishop of Nazianzus and then later in Constantinople. And Constantinople is really the heart and the center of Christianity during this period of time. So when he is there, he's leading the major church in the heart of Christianity. This is Gregory of Nazianzus. He writes he wrote a lot of great sermons, but he's got a series of sermons called the Theological Orations, which are recorded when he is the pastor in Constantinople. And it's during the time of this huge controversy. It's a theological controversy called Arianism. I'm going to talk about it just a little bit more in the future here. But the conversations on theology were so common in the city of Constantinople during this time that people would quote Nazianzen, they actually tell us in the barber shops. They would have these conversations about theology and about the sermons that this great pastor was preaching. But the great theologian had known Theosebia as she was growing and developing at the family monastery. We learn more clues about her life when Nazianzen writes to his friend Gregory of Nyssa upon the death of Theosebia. And this is what he writes in letter 197. "But what must we feel in presence of a long prevailing law of God, which has now taken my Theosebia? For I call her mine because she lived a godly life, for spiritual kindred is better than bodily." Now, because he wrote that, some people thought he had married to her. But let's just listen further. He says, "Theosebia, the glory of the church, the adornment of Christ, the helper of our generation, the hope of woman. Theosebia, the most beautiful and glorious among all the beauty of the brethren. Theosebia, truly sacred, truly consort of a priest, and of equal honor and worthy of the great sacraments. Theosebia, whom all future time shall receive, resting on immortal pillars, that is, on the souls of all who have known her now, and of all who shall be hereafter. And do not wonder that I often invoke her name, for I rejoice even in the remembrance of the Blessed One. Let this, a great deal in a few words, be her epitaph from me, and my word of condolence for you, though you yourself are quite able to console others in this way through your philosophy and many things." Now, what's fascinating about this, he says, this is a great deal in just a few words. So there are not a lot of words about her, but this passage right here, this letter, you can just unpack it. He says, she is the glory of the church. Now, what's interesting is that Nazianzen never writes anything about Macrina, the older sister. And we all think that Macrina is the most famous woman out of all this group. Now, she's the most famous because her brother, Gregory, writes about her life. And Theosebia, we just have these snippets. And yet, for the theologian, he writes about Theosebia and says she's the glory of the church. So Macrina is the one who's lifted up for her holy life. But I believe that Nazianzen valued Theosebia's willingness to serve her life in the church. Macrina did serve God, but it was through her own family monastery, which was outside the official structures of the church at the time. Theosebia gave of herself to work within the church structures and to fight for theological truth during a very difficult time. If you look at the picture that I put up of Theosebia today, you'll notice that she's holding the church in her hands. Now, he says she's truly the consort of a priest. Again, confusion. What does this mean? Consort. Consort normally meant a wife or a bride. So who was she married to? That kept being the question, and people asked that over centuries. Well, people wondered, was she Nissen's wife? Was she Nazianzen's? But we would like to suggest that she was neither, because we now have some other documents that help us understand who else could have served as a consort. There was another way to be considered the consort of a priest, and that was to be a mother who was widowed or a sister, somebody like that who was in the family. This would have to be a woman who would be willing to give up her life to serve as the partner of a priest who was her own blood relative. So she fits that category. Also, the style of ministry that she had was affirmed by the Council of Nicaea. They declared this. They said, the Great Synod has stringently forbidden any bishop, presbyter, deacon, or any one of the clergy, whatever, to have a sub-introducta dwelling with him, except only a mother or a sister and aunt, or such persons only as are beyond all suspicion. So that was from the First Council of Nicaea. Now, why was this important? Why was it that they had to make the case? And this is just a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I find it really fascinating. You see, during that period of time, you had some rogue priests who were setting up their own monasteries. Now, this was before there were really rules about how you did monasteries. And some of these men were trying to prove that they were super holy by inviting a number of women to serve with them and to even sleep in their beds with them. This is no joke. And it became a real joke about Christianity. As a matter of fact, the world looked on and said, what in the world? Because there were a number of pregnancies that were resulting as this. And so the church had to lay down the law and say, you do not bring women in to serve with you that you are not married to or are not your blood relative. And so we know the church made that distinction. And so therefore, Theosebia, if she is consort to Nyssa and she is not his wife, then she is more than likely his sister. Now, why did he need a consort? Well, he was assigned to minister in the town of Nyssa. But if we read back through some of the other documents, we become convinced that he had been married and his wife had died. He's the one that writes this huge oration on virginity that we talked about several lessons back. But he also says, but I can't be a virgin, because he basically lets us know, because I have been married. We also surmise from his document on virginity that his beautiful young wife died in childbirth. And so therefore he believes that women should be able to be set free to not have to go through this pain. Now, where do we read this? Well, this is in the document. And I just want to share with you, just so you can hear the voice of someone speaking from clear back in that 4th century. First of all, he's talking about the love that he has. He's fallen in love with this beautiful girl. He says, whenever the husband looks at that beloved face, that moment, the fear of separation accompanies the look. In other words, if I fall in love with this girl, I'm going to be afraid that maybe we can't be together. If he listens to the sweet voice, the thought comes into his mind that someday he will not hear it. Whenever he is glad with gazing on her beauty, then he shudders most with the presentiment of mourning her loss. When he marks all those charms which to youth are so precious, which the thoughtless seek for, the bright eyes beneath the lids, the arching eyebrows, the cheek with its sweet and dimpling smile, the natural red that blooms upon the lips, the gold-bound hair shining in many twisted masses on the head, and all that transient grace, then though he may be little given to reflection, he must have this thought almost in his inmost soul that someday all this beauty will melt away and become as nothing, turning after all this show into noisome and unsightly bones which wear no trace, no memorial, no remnant of that living bloom. Can he live delighted when he thinks of that? It sounds like he knew what it meant to love, and he was trying to warn other people, beware of the loss of all of this. And then he goes into this description of losing the one who's having a baby. But her time of labor comes upon the young wife, and the occasion is regarded not as the bringing of a child into the world, but as the approach of death. In bearing, it is expected that she will die. And indeed, often this sad presentiment is true. And before they spread the birthday feast, before they taste any of the expected joys, they have to change their rejoicing into lamentation. Still in love's fever, still at the height of their passionate affection, not yet having grasped life's sweetest gifts, as in the vision of a dream, they are suddenly torn away from all they possessed. But what comes next? Domestics, like conquering foes, dismantle the bridal chamber. They deck it for the funeral, but it is death's room now. They make the useless wailings and beat the hands. Then there is the memory of former days, curses on those who advised the marriage, recriminations against friends who did not stop it, blame thrown on parents, whether they be alive or dead, bitter outrage against human destiny, a reigning of the whole course of nature, complaints and accusations, even against the divine government, war within the man himself, and fighting with those who would admonish, no repugnance to the most shocking words and acts. In some, this state of mind continues, and their reason is more completely swallowed up by grief, and their tragedy has a sadder ending. Now, we surmise that to be able to write these words, that Gregory of Nyssa is expressing his own feelings, his own grief, and he's trying to actually warn people and say, you know, the consequences of marriage, the consequences of trying to bear children are so difficult. He was encouraging people to a life of virginity, but we believe that his life has died. We believe, you know, if you read all this, he's probably quite determined not to get married. But he's going to need someone now who can help him in his ministry. His mother, Amelia, and his older sister, Macrina, they can't do it. They're already too consumed with their ministry, but Theosebia, the lovely girl, who's been raised on the family monastery, who's been educated in the same home as the great theologians of her day, is willing to give up her life to help her. Church history records her as the deaconess of the city of Nyssa. This means that along the way, she had taken an official role in the life of the church. To be a deaconess in the 4th century was to be ordained. The church was in great need of more ministers, for there were not enough during that period of time. This is when all these people are converting to Christianity, and they're coming to Christianity in droves. And as hordes of women are seeking to be baptized, the church had to create space for women leaders who could do teaching and the baptism of women. Now, remember the words of Nazianzen. He says that Theosebia was of equal honor and worthy of the great sacraments. Now, I also want us to remember these are the words of Nazianzen, whose nickname is the theologian. This is someone who would not just throw around words or use them lightly. There's significance in the words that he's used here. So his words suggest that she was a partner in serving the sacraments. And the issue of sacraments and female participation has been a long-standing question in the life of the church. There are numerous arguments. One of the arguments that you hear against female participation is that on the night that Jesus served the meal, there were 12 disciples present, and they were all men. I might also want to point out they were all Jewish men. So I don't know how far we take the analogy of who that exactly has to be at the table. Another consideration throughout church history is that women have a monthly period and therefore have been deemed unclean and therefore unable to serve the sacraments. Now, I find that fascinating because you think about the significance of the story of Jesus's healing of the woman with the issue of blood. That woman, in essence, had had a period for 12 years, making her continually unclean. Therefore, her touching the hem of Jesus's garment should have made him unclean, but it did not. His holiness made her clean. So if we understand what holiness is about, and it's all about Jesus, folks, it's not about us, it's our participation in Jesus, then it's Jesus's holiness that makes us clean. And I believe that story is there intentionally to show that women are made clean. And here we have this example of Theosebia serving the sacraments in the church in the 4th century. Now, unfortunately, the church has often failed to see the significance of Jesus's incarnation and holiness in the restoration of women in the image of God. I don't think this was a stumbling block for the Cappadocian theologians. They had been raised among these incredible women. And so considering how Gregory of Nyssa recorded Macrina's chiding of his brother Basil, I can imagine that he respected Theosebia as well. And so here they are as partners in the church working and doing the ministry. And there was another practical reason why this had to be the case. You see, there was this big theological debate happening during the 1st century. It was regarding something known as Arianism. So let me take you back to the year 325, the first council meeting in Nicaea. Now, this is the first big, what we call ecumenical council meeting of the church. And it happened just after the persecutions had subsided. Constantine brings all of Christianity together because he wants to help them to be unified. It's a great reunion. There are over 300 present. And there are reports that tell us this. All of these people had written letters. They knew about one another, but they'd not seen each other. And as they gather together, they're literally showing one another their scars from their beatings and all that had happened to them and their broken bones. And brother, I survived. This is how I look. Can you imagine what this gathering must have been like? But we also believe Constantine was wanting to unite the empire. And by trying to unite the empire, he wanted to get the Christians all on the same page because he believed that might help him politically. So he actually attends the meeting, and the church is wrestling with their understanding of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, the divinity of Jesus Christ, the humanity of Jesus Christ. There's a lot of things that they've not ever gotten to be able to get together and talk about. Now, this man named Arius wasn't actually present, for whom Arianism is named, but he did have an advocate in a little town called Nicomedia that was there. But Arius had this idea. He had this idea that Jesus wasn't really God, but he was created by God, but he wasn't human. So he was some kind of a new and different creature, some kind of an intermediary. There's God, there's humans, and then Jesus had to be something different. So Christianity, here it is, wrestling with the big ideas of the Trinity. But the problem with this was creating Jesus to be something completely different. And he was incredibly popular, Arius was. He was charismatic. He found a lot of those who would support him in his ideas. He even wrote really clever songs about his theology. They were catchy, and he would walk around the city of Alexandria in Egypt, and everybody was singing about his theology. But the council soundly denounced Arianism, and one would have thought that that was the end of the battle, but it was not. Constantine, the emperor, had a summer home, and it happened to be near Nicomedia, and that's where the bishop was that supported Arius. We're guessing that after this whole council meeting is over, that he probably invites, the bishop invites the emperor over. Why not come over for a summer barbecue? Or at least they socialized in some way. And being pro-Arian, the bishop persuades the emperor to permit the teaching of Arianism. Now, those who were pro-Niceans would prove to be what we call orthodox in faith. That includes all of us who are probably listening to this today. We would be pro-Niceans, and Arianism continued to be a real problem. Now, the emperor's attitude led to an almost theological civil war all across what is modern-day Turkey. Bishops were either pro or anti-Arian. And they would gather themselves around other priests that had the same theological persuasion. And the reason we have so many writings from the Cappadocian Fathers is that they wrote a large number of letters and sermons in defense of the faith. They, and rightly so, that the future of Christianity was at stake in this theological discussion. So when Basil, the big brother, becomes bishop of Caesarea, he becomes a regional overseer. And to help secure the territory against the Arians, this becomes really political. He appoints his friends and family members to be bishops of certain territories. It's like playing Risk. He's going to put people in position so that he can gain more territory. So he assigns his friend Gregory Nazianzen, the theologian, to this town of Nazianzus. And interestingly, his friend Gregory is not pleased. Now, he describes Nazianzus as a one-horse town. Now, remember, Cappadocia was the world of horse ranchers, and this is a one-horse town, and his best friend has just sent him basically to the end of the world to be the bishop, and that's frustrating. Gregory was so angry at his best friend Basil for this designation that he didn't even speak to him for years. It also caused problems for the great theologian later in life because he ends up being designated as the Bishop of Constantinople. That was the big top dog assignment. He's proud of that assignment. He goes to the city, becomes the great preacher, and he presides over the beginning of the council meeting of Constantinople in 381 until they find out that he had been appointed Bishop of Nazianzus, the one-horse town. You see, you were never allowed to be bishop of one city and then another. It was a lifetime appointment. So when we refer to him as Nazianzen, we are referring to him even today as the bishop of the one-horse town. He was stripped of his title in Constantinople. He was thrown out of the chair, and he was so frustrated that he went to Seleucia, to the shrine of Thecla, to go lick his wounds. And I would say it was probably a good thing that his best friend Basil was already dead. But I digress. While Basil assigned his best friend to the one-horse town, he didn't do much better for his brother, assigning him to the little town of Nyssa. His brother Gregory took his assignment, and he took his sister Theosebia with him. And somewhere along the way, the political authority of the region of Nyssa became pro-Arian. In other words, now Gregory of Nyssa is the enemy. And when this happened, they would often exile priests, sending them away so that they could reintroduce their thinking into the church community. So the result was that Gregory was exiled. He was sent away, thrown away from his church for 2 years. But what they didn't know was that there was a secret weapon, and that was Theosebia. And Theosebia was still going to be there. So there are authors that tell us that they believe that her office, the work that she did, included the celebration of the Mass, perhaps leading to the performance of the divine office, and surely the spiritual and maybe also material support of pious women, which were known as the choir virgins in that town of Nyssa, and probably also Christian women in Nyssa. The choir virgins most certainly existed and is referred to Gregory of Nyssa's letter number 3 to Ablabius, to whom he writes on his return from exile. Now, just imagine 2 years have gone by. He's not been allowed to be in his town. He's not been allowed to be at his church. And the day that he returns, he sits down and he pens a letter to one of his friends, and he tells him this about his return. But after we had persuaded them with difficulty to allow us to get down and to let our mules pass, we were crushed on every side by folks crowding round, insomuch that their excessive kindness all but made us faint. And when we were near the inside of the portico, we see a stream of fire flowing into the church, for the choir of virgins, carrying their wax torches in their hands, were just marching in file along the entrance of the church, kindling the whole into splendor with their blaze. And when I was within and had rejoiced and wept with my people, for I experienced both emotions from witnessing both in the multitude. Now you see, Gregory's exile was about theological battles. But Theosebia, she's the one who stayed in that town for 2 years. And having been raised under the influence of her grandmother Macrina, she would have learned the importance of maintaining the faith during periods of persecution. Remember, that was about courage. So not only did she learn perseverance and courage, but considering the home in which she was raised, she would have understood the theological doctrinal debates of her day. And this would have been a rather delicate accomplishment, since Gregory was banished and the opposition would have been there to have influence in the community. But the fact that Gregory was greeted with such exuberance on his return becomes a testimony to the work of his sister Theosebia. And it reflects the fact that she maintained not only a united congregation in support of their bishop, but also in support of what we call Nicene orthodoxy. Service to the church was very important to the Cappadocian Fathers. Their commitment helped them to shape the future of Christianity, and therefore giving themselves in service to the church became for them a practice of virtue. So think about it this way. If they believed that service to God through the church could be a practice of virtue, could that also be a practice of virtue for a woman? What if that was something that God did call women to do? And to keep them from it might mean to hold them back from the life of holiness that God has intended. I have to tell you, this is the place that I discovered my own call. My own call was a call to wholehearted obedience to God. And I discovered that my life of holiness was going to be dependent upon my willingness to serve God in the church, because that's what God asked me to do. There's a lot there. And finding Theosebia was one of the answers to my questions in my search when I began with the rebirth of the Orthodox Church, and that women were lighting candles and sweeping the floors. And I said, surely somewhere in history, the women had done something more. And surely they had. They had given themselves wholeheartedly to serving the church as partners and ministers, doing all the work of the church when it was necessary for the church to survive. Out of all of this, we come to the virtue of kindness. So when kindness is thoroughly considered, what surfaces is a mother of virtues, because kindness is the outcome of Christian formation when it is freshly squeezed using only the organic ingredients of faith, hope, and love. So what we see from this woman is kindness. And kindness doesn't concern itself with purifying the soul or sanctifying the mind. This virtue, I love this, is Martha in the kitchen. When the other virtues are Mary at Jesus's knee, and it's practical because it needs to be. You see, Theosebia figured out the practical way to be in service, and that was her kindness. So kindness makes sacred our most common interactions. Think about this: kindness toward the overworked store clerk. Kindness today towards the exhausted young mom. Kindness toward the child that's asked you the same question multiple times in the same day, and kindness towards those with whom you work. Now, I'm lesson's going a little bit longer, and I'll try to appeal it with Nonna and Justice and maybe not take as long. I'm sorry, I get excited about this material. But we've talked about the great theologian, Gregory. His mother, her name was Nonna. She had an arranged marriage. Her husband was not a Christian. She's a woman that devoted herself to intercessory prayer. And I think that's one of the most important things that we need to think about for her. I'm going to just a quote here about her. It says, she prostrated herself before God day and night, and besought him with many fastings and tears for the salvation of her husband. And she zealously devoted herself to her husband and strove to win him in various ways by reproaches, admonitions, attentions, estrangements, and most of all by her own character and fervent piety, by means of which the soul is especially swayed and softened and willingly constrained to virtue. It was inevitable that the drop of water constantly striking the rock should hollow it out and in time accomplish its purpose, as the sequel shows. All right, so this is where she gets her nickname. Her nickname is the drip that hollowed out the stone. I don't know if I'd want to have that nickname, but that's what she has. In other words, her prayers constantly striking the rock made a difference. And it says, and then the sequel is her husband, but it's also her children who come to Jesus Christ. So after years of prayer and prodding, her husband becomes a believer. Nonna was a mother who invested heavily in her children. She was determined to pass along the faith that she had inherited. She had a daughter, Gorgonia, was her firstborn. She gave birth to two sons, Gregory Nazianzen, and a boy named Caesarius. It does not appear Nazianzen's parents, Gregory and Nonna, I mean, it does look like they had struggled with infertility and did not have children until they were older. Nazianzen frequently refers to them as Abraham and Sarah, himself to Isaac. There were times that he also refers to Nonna's prayer for a child as those of Hannah, who prayed for Samuel. So when the children came, she's going to pour everything she can into her children. She hires a private tutor to teach them so that they can have the highest educational standards. Her son becomes the theologian. The other son, Caesarius, becomes a medical doctor, and he at one point becomes the medical doctor to the emperor of the Roman Empire. So pretty amazing kids that she raises. But Gregory, the son, has this understanding of humanity being restored in the image of God, which he said is for all people, men and women. And he allowed for the type of partnered relationship that he saw in his parents that was very unusual during that time. He says this, for the best in men and women was so united in their marriage that their marriage was more of a union of virtue than of bodies. Although they surpassed all others, they themselves were so evenly matched in virtue that they could not surpass each other. Both Nonna and her husband Gregory, their goal and the focus of their whole lives was to be transformed into the image of God, and that's what they wanted for their children. He goes on to say this, but she who was given by God to my father became not only his helper, for this would be less wonderful, but also a leader, personally guiding him by deed and word to what was most excellent. Although she deemed it best, in accordance with the law of marriage, to be overruled by her husband in other respects, she was not ashamed to show herself his master in piety. While beauty, natural as well as artificial, is wont to be a source of pride and glory to other women, she is one who has ever recognized only one beauty, that of the soul, and the preservation and, to the best of her power, the purification of the divine image in her soul. So it's really interesting that she is portrayed as a wife who, in obedience to Christ, was willing at times to lead her husband. Nazianzen saw his parents as a couple where each was able to serve the other in an equal partnership, adjusting their roles and their circumstances of life for whatever drew them on to holiness was considered the highest authority. So they're a fascinating couple. In antiquity, the virtue of justice is influenced by Aristotelian reasoning. It was defined in terms of quantity. Each individual was expected to practice the proper balance of moderation. So I want you to think about justice and the scales of justice that we see. And that justice says that the scales become balanced one way to another. Nonna found the way to balance the scales in her life was also in her relationship with her husband. They had a very unique relationship where the son says one was sometimes the leader, sometimes the other was the leader. And in the end, it balanced out in terms of both of them on a journey towards virtue. She also found justice accessible through prayer. And how in the world might we balance the scales through prayer? I think we do that by bringing injustices before the Lord. Not every injustice can you and I fight. Sometimes we cannot do anything in our own power to readjust the scales, but God certainly can. And I think if we look at Nonna and Nonna's life, we need to realize that we need to have a renewed emphasis and focus on prayer in our own lives. But there's also action. Respecting the rights of others is fundamental to creating strong and healthy relationships. So what do you do when you see injustice? This was something that we talked about with our children when we raised them in Russia. What were they going to do, our children, when they saw people who were sick or needy on the street corners every day? And in the early years that we were there, that was a real reality. I remember we would walk our little daughter, Christy, to school, and every day we walked her to school, there would be people passed out laying on the street. This is a child that learned to see the needs of people. She would work with us in our feeding programs where we would go and we would deliver food to the needy people. She knew that if there were people who were alcoholics who were hungry, that we would go and we would buy them a loaf of bread and bring them their bread. This is part of life where you look at it and you say, how do I partake? How do I participate in this? Basil the Great had a sermon called, "I Will Tear Down My Barns." And I think he has some powerful words for us in closing this morning. related to justice. In his sermon, he said, "You begrudge your fellow human beings what you yourself enjoy. Taking wicked counsel in your soul, you consider not how you might distribute to others according to their needs, but rather how, after having received so many good things, you might rob others. Who are the greedy? Those who are not satisfied with what suffices for their own needs. Who are the robbers? Those who take for themselves what rightly belongs to everyone. And you, are you not greedy? Are you not a robber? The things you received in trust as stewardship, have you not appropriated them for yourself? Is not the person who strips another of clothes called a thief? And those who do not clothe the naked when they have the power to do so, should they not be called the same? The bread you are holding back is for the hungry. The clothes you keep away are for the naked. The shoes that are rotting away with disuse are for those who have none, and the silver you keep buried in the earth is for the needy. Thus, you are thus guilty of injustice toward as many as you might have aided and did not." I confess to you, I find his sermon convicting today, for he sees injustice not as a virtue at all, but that justice is a virtue. We're living in the season of COVID. It shouldn't be too hard to live into the virtues of kindness and justice, I don't think. And I'm sorry this has gone a little bit longer today, but my prayer is that you'll think of ways in which these virtues can be lived out in your own life. I'll be posting some questions for reflection, and I look forward to meeting with you next week as we look to the lives of the women in the next 2 chapters. May God bless you. If you have questions, feel free to post them to me, and I will see you again next week. Bye-bye.